In this lesson, then, we'll begin our tour through a cartoon cell, and we'll focus on the cell boundary and what we mean by the chemistry of life. Here's our cartoon cell. It's a simple bacterium, and this would be the kind of cell that scientists think emerged on planet Earth some 4 billion years ago. Of course, bacteria today are more complicated than those first simple life forms, but we're going to use the simplest kind of cell to understand life. Here we have the 4 categories of molecules that we find in the cell. We have lipids that will be found in the cell membrane, forming the boundary of the cell. We have proteins that are going to do the bulk of the chemistry of life, all kinds of important chemical reactions. We have sugars, oftentimes a source of energy for the cell, sometimes a building material. And then DNA, the hereditary molecule for cells on Earth. Now, all cells have a cell membrane. Some cells also have a cell wall, but the membrane is what we'll focus on this moment. Here on the left, we see a cutaway of a cartoon cell, and the boundary, the cell membrane, is exposed. We can see the inside surface of the membrane, and it's composed of 2 layers of these molecules called lipids. Here we see magnification over here. And you can sort of identify like the head of the lipid and then 2 tails. Now, lipid molecules are constructed from fat. In fact, the tail of these lipid molecules are fat molecules. So when we eat fat in our diet, we're getting the molecules we need to build lipids. Lipids are the molecules that are found in the cell membrane. And when they arrange themselves into this 2-layer structure, it makes a flexible boundary, separating the cell from the external world and also keeping the contents of the cell inside. Now, small molecules like oxygen can pass right through the lipid bilayer, right through the membrane and into the cell. Likewise, with carbon dioxide, could leave the cell if it wanted to. But larger molecules like glucose are going to bounce off the cell membrane. They won't be able to get in. So larger molecules need assistance. And what cells do is they insert special protein channels in the membrane. And these are like the gateways to allow molecules in or out of the cell. And each particular large molecule then would have its own special channel to either get into or out of the cell. So these proteins make the membrane selectively permeable, allowing only certain molecules to enter and exit the cell. So back to our cartoon, we see an example up here. Here's a channel protein that is assisting glucose to enter the cell. Now, this particular channel is specialized for transporting glucose. It's not going to work for any old molecule. It's specialized to allow glucose into the cell. And there would be other protein channels to allow other kinds of nutrients, maybe amino acids or some other kinds of materials in the environment. So cells have specialized proteins to do these import jobs. And likewise, they have specialized proteins to export waste molecules. Now, proteins are an important class of molecules. We're going to see a whole bunch of them here in a moment, but let's examine a little bit about these proteins. Proteins are adaptations, and that's a special word in biology. An adaptation is a DNA-based characteristic of an organism that promotes survival and or reproduction. Adaptations are the result of an evolutionary process in which individuals with different characteristics compete for survival and reproduction. Mr. Darwin will help us understand this process of natural selection. Individuals with the best traits have more offspring, and if the trait is DNA-based, they will pass on that trait to their offspring, and this is how you get evolution. In a cell, proteins are molecular adaptations. They are parts with a purpose. Proteins evolved to perform different functions within the cell. So when we look at our cartoon cell here, all of these proteins are going to have different functions because of an evolutionary process. Just as the long neck of the giraffe has a purpose, right? We would say that's an adaptation to feed from the leaves high up. Well, these proteins are adaptations as well. They had an evolutionary history. They acquired their purpose through this evolutionary process. Proteins are made from molecules called amino acids. Here's the simplest kind of amino acid. There are 20 different kinds of amino acids, and they differ by what is attached right here to this carbon here. Proteins are chains of amino acids. So each little bead here is an amino acid. So proteins can be very, very long chains. They can be tens, hundreds, even thousands of amino acids long. And here we see phenylalanine, and there's the basic structure of an amino acid. But there are 20 different kinds of amino acids, and all living cells are using the same building blocks, the same amino acids, to build all their proteins. It's just different species hook up these amino acids in different sequences to make species-specific proteins. Each different kind of protein has a unique amino acid sequence, and here we see the sequence of amino acids here. And that sequence of amino acids determines how the molecule folds up into a three-dimensional shape. And the shape of the protein determines what its job is, or what it can do, its function. So if we go changing the amino acid sequence, we change how it folds up, and we might impair its function, or it might do a different function. It might be able to do a different job. So the sequence of amino acids is really important. Now here is a picture, a structural picture of a protein called myoglobin, and you can see it is composed of many, many atoms. So the key down here, we have hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen atoms. So a protein is a very large molecule composed of many, many atoms. Now proteins in the cell oftentimes are responsible for doing chemical reactions. So for example, this big protein, let's say its job is to make a chemical bond between the yellow one and the purple one. The first step in that process is the yellow molecule and the purple molecule have to bind to the protein at a certain region called the active site. And the reason they bind is because they're sticky. So the structure of the protein at this location makes it so that this particular purple molecule can stick right there, and the yellow one sticks here. Now the protein is going to act on these molecules, perhaps making a chemical bond between them. And the idea here is that the protein is specialized to do this job because it's only these molecules that can stick at this location, in the right location for the chemistry to happen. Whereas these molecules up here, they will bounce off the protein. There's no place for them to stick. So this protein cannot do anything with these molecules because it can't grab a hold of them to do anything with them. This molecule is able to bind to the protein, and perhaps it regulates the protein in some fashion. So proteins do specific jobs because they only bind specific molecules. Now let's take a look at some of the categories of functions that proteins perform in the cell. And when all the proteins are performing all their jobs well, that's what we mean by the chemistry of life. The proteins are functional and they're doing the chemistry to sustain the life of the cell. So what is that chemistry? Well, there's whole teams of proteins that are tasked with the job of releasing energy from food. So here's glucose entering the cell. There will be teams of proteins that will start to break down glucose and release energy. And then there's other teams of protein that package that released energy into special molecules called ATP. This is a usable form of energy for the cell. And then there are teams of proteins that use the ATP energy to build other molecules that the cell needs. Where does it get the starting materials? Perhaps nutrients that were imported through these channel proteins. Now, why are cells building all these molecules? Because cells are made of molecules. And, the cell's not going to get ready-made parts from the environment necessarily. So the cell imports whatever kind of nutrients it can and then uses those nutrients to build the molecular parts that it needs. We can sort of identify two categories of chemical reactions: those reactions involved in extracting energy from food, for example, and those chemical reactions involved in building things, construction projects. Together, we say that's what we mean by metabolism, those life-sustaining chemical reactions that keep a cell going. Now, for a typical cell like a bacterium here, there might be tens of millions of proteins in each cell. And if we think that the genetic material, the DNA of bacteria, stores the recipes, let's say 5,000 or 6,000 different kinds of proteins. So that means that the cell is making many of each kind of proteins. Perhaps there are hundreds or thousands of each different kind of protein are produced. So in this cartoon, it's a gross simplification. We just have one of this kind of protein, one of this kind of protein, one of this kind of protein. In reality, there might be hundreds or thousands of these different kinds of proteins. So we've got lots of protein players performing the chemistry of life. In a bacteria, about 1 billion metabolic reactions each second. 1 billion chemical reactions every second. Now, proteins must be built within the cell. And in this scene, the cell is sort of using the information in DNA, making a temporary copy of that information in a molecule called messenger RNA. And then this ribosome is the structure that's going to use the recipe to build a protein. One ribosome is composed of approximately 250 million atoms. We're talking huge molecular structures. So DNA is the hereditary molecule. The cell can store, use, and duplicate information because it has this molecule of DNA. Specifically, DNA stores the information to make proteins. And since DNA can be duplicated, then the cell can pass on that information to its offspring, daughter cells. And we also learned that, of course, during duplication, sometimes mistakes happen. And so the offspring of this parent cell might have different recipes. They might be different from the parent, different from each other, and this allows for evolutionary change. Now, it should be pointed out that the cell is composed of molecules which are not alive. None of the proteins in this picture is a living thing. DNA is not alive. The lipids in the membrane are not alive. Glucose molecules are non-living. So we've got a situation where cells are composed of non-living molecules, yet the whole cell is alive. It has all of the characteristics on that list that we learned about. And that's what life is then. It's this self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. Life is a chemical process. Death, then, is the failure of the chemical process. Each of these proteins is a functional part. It's a part with a purpose. It's doing an important job. So life emerges from the interactions of non-living functional molecules. When these interactions stop, death is the result.